Thank you. It was wonderful to be here with you this evening. If you'll pardon me, I'm going to sit. If any of you are familiar with the Enneagram, it came out of Sufi philosophy, and oh, there's a great stool. Thank you. Anyway, my number, there are 9 categories in this Enneagram. My category is number 9, and the motto of the 9s is, why stand when you can sit? And why sit when you can lie down? That's the story of my life. I was thinking before coming up here, it isn't very often that I've been preceded by the boss with the guitar, and Yo-Yo Ma with the cello, and Ricky Ricardo on the drums. What an interesting combination that was. But it was wonderful to come in, and I apologize for being late. As I was coming over here, there were literally a gazillion people on bicycles blocking the streets, and your main source of transportation is the bicycle. And making it very hard for me to love you right at this moment. I don't confess that. But thanks be to God, I got here, and Tim was out there and got me a place to park. And so, let me tell you just a little bit about me. I am a Capuchin Franciscan. In Spanish and Italian, the word for Capuchin is cappuccino. The beverage is named for us. And the reason for that is that it's an espresso, kind of a coffee espresso, and you put the cream on it, and it turns the kind of the same color as my habit. And we have on our habit a capuche. It's very big and very pointed. And the cream on top of the espresso reminded the Italians of a Capuchin with his hood up. And so they said, cappuccino, and the name stuck. But there's also a breed of monkeys that's named for us in South America. And when the Spaniards went to South America, they saw these monkeys that they look like they're bald on top, because they have very, very short hair on top, and then they have longer hair that looks like a beard. And it used to be mandatory for Capuchins to have a beard. And so when the Spaniards saw these monkeys looking like I do, they said, cappuccinos, and the name stuck. But the monkeys were named for us, not the other way around. How many of you know anything at all about Francis of Assisi? Okay, I'm just going to put somebody on the spot there. The lady there with the white. What do you know about St. Francis of Assisi?
St. Francis. I know that he traveled around a lot.
He traveled around a lot, that's true. And he was forbidden by the rule that he himself wrote to ride on a donkey or any other animal. So he walked a lot.
Yeah, and he walked.
Had he lived in San Francisco, he would have learned to love riding on a donkey. Because only crazy people would build a city on these hills, and they did. Assisi is a town in central Italy, and the fact that he was from Assisi plays an important role in his life, because Assisi is in a region of Italy called Umbria. And across the valley in Umbria is another little town that you're very familiar with if you like chocolate, called Perugia. You've all heard of Perugia chocolate? Perugia and Assisi were constantly fighting each other. You know, they didn't fight other countries in those days, they fought the next town. And you know, it'd be like if we decided to go to war against San Bruno. We'd win. But Assisi and Perugia were constantly fighting each other, and so Francis, as a young man, wanted to be a knight. And he wanted to fight in the battle against Perugia. His father, who was a part of the emerging nobility, a kind of an upper-class salesman of cloth, decided that, well, Francis is going to be a knight, he's got to have the best of everything. And so he bought him the best of armor and the weaponry and so forth. And Francis was going to go off on a battle against the Perugians. And that night, he had a dream. And in the dream, somebody spoke to him. It didn't occur to him at the time who the voice was, but the voice said, "Francis, who's greater, the Lord, the Master, or the servant?" And Francis said, "The Lord, the Master." And the voice said, "Then why are you serving the servant?" Now, that didn't have any great impact on him at the moment. He kind of filed it away. But as he was going off to fight against Perugia, he ran across a knight who was very, very poor, whose armor was old and dented and not at all like the brand new shining state-of-the-art stuff that Francis's father had bought him. And so Francis was moved with pity for this poor knight and gave him all of the new stuff that his father had bought him, and he took the old stuff, which may have contributed to the next big event that happened in his life, which was he became a prisoner of war. He was captured. As a prisoner of war, he got very, very sick. His father paid a great deal of money to ransom him and bring him back to Assisi. Now, before he went off to be in the army against Perugia, Francis was a bon vivant. He loved to party. He loved to hang around with his friends. He was the leader, the ringleader. He was a troubadour. He was very much into wine, women, and song. After his experience in the war and having been a prisoner of war for about a year and getting very, very sick, he became very, very introspective and began to think seriously about life and the meaning of life and his place in life. And so he found himself spending a great deal of time in prayer and going to these little chapels that scattered the countryside around Assisi. And he was in one of these little chapels called San Damiano, and he was praying when he thought he heard the voice of Jesus speaking to him from the crucifix. Now, San Damiano was a chapel that was in very, very bad repair. Holes in the roof, parts of the wall were standing, parts of the walls weren't. And the voice of Jesus said to Francis, "Francis, rebuild my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin." Francis takes it very, very literally that Jesus wants him to repair that chapel, and he goes to his father's cloth shop, gets a bunch of his father's cloth, sells it, buys stones and mortar and tools, and he goes out and he very happily begins rebuilding San Damiano. And his father comes back from a business trip, finds out what Francis has done, and is livid, and puts Francis on trial in front of the whole town. This was like the biggest news in the city. This was bigger than Ross Micarimi. Is that the guy's name? The sheriff? Mercarimi. Yeah, this was bigger news in Assisi than the sheriff's news was here in San Francisco. Everybody in town turned out in the town square to see what was going to happen when Francis's father dragged his own son in front of an ecclesiastical court, in front of a church court, because Francis was working for the church, and his father was suing him, and so the bishop was going to hear the case, and Francis stuns everybody. He takes off every stitch of clothing that he has on, and that's why I think San Francisco was named for him. He goes to his father and he lays his clothing at his father's feet and says, "You know, up until this point, I have called Pietro Bernardone my father. But from now on, I shall say only, our Father who art in heaven." And the bishop gave him a robe that had belonged to a beggar, and he couldn't afford a leather belt, so he put a rope around his waist. And Francis went back to repairing San Damiano, and the people thought he was crazy. And he was. Francis was crazy, but he was crazy about Jesus, who spoke to him from the cross and said, "Rebuild my house." And at the beginning, people treated Francis like he was some sort of a mental case. When he would go into town and beg for his food or beg for money to get more stones and more the material to build the chapel. People would laugh at him, they would mock him, children would throw rocks at him and mud. But lo and behold, as people began to see Francis' simplicity, his humility, how he took all of these insults and took them in stride and just kept doing what he said that Jesus told him to do, people started to follow him. And that is the beginning of the Franciscan order. Now that ties directly into San Francisco, because San Francisco was founded by followers of St. Francis. It's followers of the Franciscan order who in the 18th century came to San Francisco with the Spaniards. And the Spaniards established themselves, the military, over in what's now the Presidio. And the friars established themselves at what is now Mission Dolores, over at Dolores and 16th. And Mission Dolores, most people don't know this, but Mission Dolores has an official name, which is Misión de San Francisco de Asís. It's named for St. Francis, and that's how the city got the name, San Francisco, even though up until the time it became a city, it was known as Good Herb, Yerba Buena. And the reason the mission is called Mission Dolores is there's a little stream that is now underground that was named for Our Lady of Sorrows, the Blessed Virgin Mary, under her title of Our Lady of Sorrows, and in Spanish that's Dolores. And so that's how it became known as Mission Dolores. Now, two things about St. Francis I want to share with you, and then I'll shut up and let you ask questions and so forth, is that the two things that were most impactful on Francis in his life, in his conversion, in his being crazy about Jesus: Christmas and the cross, the crib and the cross. Francis wanted people to appreciate as much as he did that God loved the world so much that he sent his son into the world, not to condemn the world, but to save it. And so for Francis, Christmas was the big celebration of this great love of God. I just killed the microphone. Oh, it came back to life. And so one time in the little town of Gubbio, they were going to have Christmas Eve Mass, and Francis came up with a great idea. Let's reenact the Nativity. And so he brought in live, can you all hear me?
No, keep going, it'll come back.
It'll come back? Oh, okay. Barry has the healing power. He brought in live animals, and he had statues of Mary and Joseph and the shepherds, and there was a little statue of the baby Jesus. And during the course of the Mass, Francis walked over and he picked up the statue of the baby Jesus and held it, and the people in the congregation were stunned because they could have sworn that that baby came to life in Francis's arms and began to move. And so they began to realize that being crazy about Jesus is not such a bad thing, that it's actually quite wondrous. And so the wonder of Christmas is something that Francis was very, very enamored of, and he wanted everybody to realize that Christmas was about the outpouring of God's love. That no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, you are greatly loved by God, who humbled himself to take on our poverty. And this is why Francis was so devoted to poverty. It wasn't because being poor was such a great thing. Poverty was what God did. God made himself poor by laying aside all of his divine prerogatives and being a little baby. God had to cry to say, feed me. God had to cry to say, change me. God had to cry to say, hold me, embrace me, hug me, kiss me, take care of me. And so for Francis, poverty and Christmas are very closely aligned. And then we go to the other end of Jesus' life. Why did Jesus come into the world? God sent his son into the world not to condemn the world, but to save it. And he took upon himself all of our sins, all of our faults, all of our failings. and he nailed them to the cross when he allowed his son to be nailed to the cross. And so Francis wanted to be like Jesus so much that he wanted to die for Jesus. He wanted to be a martyr. He went to North Africa, he went to Egypt when there were crusades going on, and he was hoping that the Muslims would dislike him so much that they would kill him. They loved St. Francis. And he went to see the Sultan in Egypt, and the Sultan was in this tent, and he had a rug put down, and on the rug he had the cross. All over the rug was the cross. He said, now if this Christian is really a good follower of Jesus, he would never step on the cross. And Francis walks into the Sultan's tent and walks right across all of the crosses. And the Sultan says, aha, you're a fraud. You walked across the holy symbol of your faith. And Francis said, no. There were 3 crosses that day. 2 of them belonged to thieves. I walked on their crosses only. The Sultan said, you know, I kind of like this guy. Much to Francis's chagrin, because he wanted the guy to kill him. And the Sultan said, you know, I like you. Go anywhere you want in my territory. He's behind enemy lines. Go anywhere you want in my territory. Preach whatever you want. Say whatever you want. Talk to whomever you want. Gave him just free rein. And Francis did go and share the gospel with those who would listen. But he went back to Italy rather dejected because he didn't get to experience the cross as Jesus did. He didn't get to shed his blood for their faith. And so one day, just 2 years before he died, Francis was deep in prayer on Mount Laverna near Assisi, and Jesus appears to him again, this time as a 6-winged seraph. And from the wings of the seraph, beams of light penetrated Francis's body. And when the event was over and Francis came to, he had in his hands and his feet and his side the 5 wounds of the cross. He wanted to be like Jesus so much that he wanted to be crucified, and so Jesus granted him that wish. And 2 years later, Francis, only in his 40s, died once again, naked. He had the friars strip him of everything. And outside the little chapel called the Portiuncula, which means little portion, he had them lay him on the ground. He looked up at Assisi, he blessed it. And on the evening of October 3rd, 1226, he gave up his soul. And the most amazing thing happened. Once he fell asleep in the Lord, all of the birds began to ascend into the sky. Birds don't do that in the evening. They all ascended into the sky, and they hovered around and flew around, and they were all singing God's praises for Francis, who saw the birds as brothers and sisters, who saw the fish as brothers and sisters and preached to them, who saw all of God's creation as brother or sister. Because for Francis, there was no pantheism. There was no God is in the mountain, God is in the tree, God is in you, God is in me. No. For Francis, everything that God made was a reflection of God. Not that it could contain God, but that it could reflect him. And the greatest reflection of God for Francis was other human beings. And that's why Francis accepted everyone, loved everyone, because each person is the image and likeness of God. Each person is a mirror up to which God shows us his face in some form or another. Why do people love Francis? Because Francis loved them. But why did Francis love them? Because he was crazy. To love people, and you walk around San Francisco, here in the Tenderloin, up in the North Beach where the shrine is, you know, to love some of the people that inhabit the city, you got to be crazy. Crazy about Jesus. Amen. And see him in each one of those people. As Blessed Mother Teresa used to say, Jesus sometimes comes to us in the most distressing disguises. and they're all headed for San Francisco. You know that and I know that, and we welcome them and we greet them and we embrace them because this is the city of St. Francis. He would welcome them. He would embrace them. We can do no less.